In 2019, when I started my master's at the Naval Postgraduate School, the main stories in my newsfeed were all about the migrant crisis at the US southern border. As a former asylum officer who had just returned from a deployment to screen applicants for credible fear, it was frustrating to hear politicians, pundits, media figures simplify and politicize the issues. For instance, figures like former President Trump stroked the fear of an immigrant invasion and characterized the crisis as migrants seeking to exploit loopholes in the asylum program. Meanwhile, there are critics who argue that the real crisis was a humanitarian one, exacerbated by the Trump administration's efforts to keep asylum seekers from their legal rights to protection. So this frustration led me to my questions. Is there a crisis? If so, what is the nature of the crisis? How can we arrive at a better understanding of the asylum program at the Southwest border? The US asylum program at the border occupies this contentious, dynamic space because it's at once the locale of the US humanitarian efforts, but also its border enforcement concerns. The number of asylum seekers at the Mexico-U.S. border began to soar in 2014 as families fled violence and poverty in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. The asylum screening backlog grew by more than 777%, from 9,000 in fiscal year 2010 to 79,000 in fiscal year 2017. The situation is also compounded by a mounting affirmative asylum case backlog and removal cases awaiting hearings in the immigration court. However, the idea of a crisis is not new. There was a crisis in 1986 when border apprehension numbers skyrocketed to more than 1.6 million. Then Congress reacted with deterrence measures, for instance, making it illegal to employ undocumented immigrants. When apprehension numbers creeped up again in the late 1980s, Congress increased BP's personnel and overhauled its process. However, apprehension numbers continue to ebb and flow. The BP's National Strategic Plan in 1994 called for prevention through deterrence, the concentration of personnel, infrastructure, and surveillance technology at the border. When the Trump administration took control of the White House in 2017, it continued this default of using deterrence, calling for building walls, metering, separating families, and the Remain in Mexico program. In 2021, under the Biden administration, we continue to hear about a border crisis when it's convenient. As the evidence shows, each time the number of migrants, displaced people, asylum seekers increase at the border, policymakers react with deterrence measures. However, these linear responses inherently lead to more problems because we never tackle the root of the issue. The Homeland Security space is a complicated and chaotic one. It defies these linear cause and effect explanations and solutions. To get to the roots of the issue and make sense of the complexities of migration, I analyze beyond data sets and charts by also studying the problem from multiple perspectives. So my thesis uses a mixed qualitative method, fictional scenarios, and historical background to provide a more comprehensive portrait of the complex problems at the Southwest border. I developed a concept called muted voices to identify, access, and hear the subjective stories of the transient border community. It is based on Chris Bellavita's theory of radical subjectivity, that individual interpretation and reflection of sense data can actually act as a qualitative baseline for approaching issues in the complex and chaotic Homeland Security space. The fictional scenarios are the aggregates of primary and secondary sources, including articles, agency memos, whistleblower reports, the conversations I have with my colleagues, as well as the over 1,000 interviews I conducted as a USCIS officer. They reflect real places, people, and immigration policies and procedure. The narrative follows a displaced Honduran youth fleeing his home to seek asylum at the US-Mexico border, the Border Patrol agent that he encounters, as well as the USCIS officer who screens him for credible fear. Meanwhile, the historical background contextualizes their experience within history, society, and policy to represent a more holistic understanding of the border ecosystem and attempts to illuminate the everyday realities, struggles, the complexities of these interactions. Together, they unpack some of the drivers of migration and the conflict between border enforcement and US humanitarian efforts, and they challenge mainstream media's portrayal of a migrant crisis. The evidence shows that the current influx of family and children seeking protection is driven by poverty, crime, and violence. But these conditions are the result of years of micro and macro level migration drivers such as civil war, hurricanes, and other natural disasters, deportation of gang members from the United States, and corrupt governments. They intertwine, they enforce each other, they compel an individual reaction that can reverberate for generations. As the regional superpower, the United States also share responsibility in creating many of these migration drivers. The US asylum system is set up to erase these nuances and delineate an individual as either a refugee, a victim in need of compassion, or a migrant, a worker seeking employment. But voluntary migration is often a product of structural inequalities, the result of a history of discrimination and exploitation. The evidence also demonstrates that the US government interventions often exacerbate and create border enforcement tension. The laws of 1980s, 1990s, post 9/11 led the US government to institute these staffing, strategic, structural changes that turned US Border Patrol into law enforcement officers, militarized to stop illicit drugs and criminals. However, BP agents continue to be an asylum seeker's first contact with the US government and its people. When we look at a day in the life of a Border Patrol agent, we see the stress, the desensitization, the trauma from the daily praxis of boarding, ordering, and othering. It produced this racist and xenophobic view that cause harm to migrants, as well as create moral wounds that contribute to more than 100 suicides among CBP staff in just 12 years. Finally, the evidence shows that while the Trump administration's policy and procedural changes reduced the number of migrants entering the United States, they also intentionally dismantled and reshaped the US Asylum Program to reduce humanitarian benefits. The increased case processing time, the reduction in the asylum system's quality integrity, the loss of career rank and file staff weakens the US immigration system. As a primary function of a democracy, a weak immigration system makes a nation unable to manage mobility, security, and global interconnectedness. It undermines the US national identity, value, and way of life. The crisis at the border has no single easy solution, but there are some broader policy issues that we can tackle. The concept of muted voices challenges irrational populist notions and the mainstream media's portrayal of immigrants. The way I share their stories alongside that of a USCIS officer, a Border Patrol agent, shows the humanity in the crisis and breaks down this notion of the other, expands on the endeavor to centralize the people in a more compassionate manner, offering a more ethical approach to homeland security issues. Hearing muted voices can help us improve policies, processes, and procedures through experiencing a visceral, human account of the dynamic interaction between a bureaucratic architecture and the people who work and pass through it. This treatment produces a more radical, thorough understanding that can enrich our foundational knowledge of the field. The circumstances that push distressed individuals and families to flee the United States are complex. Because policymakers have failed to decipher how migration functions, its evolving nature and changing patterns, its drivers, and how it built on the past, the United States has misidentified points of intervention and missed opportunities for adaptation and mitigation. Thus, I recommend that the United States must confront its past interventions and the unintended consequences of its foreign and domestic policies, a regional truth and reconciliation to achieve true collaboration with other stakeholders and find durable solutions. The United States also must rein in its border enforcement practices of bordering, ordering, and othering, and refine the role of Border Patrol agents. CBP needs to confront the consequences of its practices, primarily the distancing that has produced and cultivated racist and xenophobic views, and the emotional anguish that contributed to suicide among its staff. I end with posing some questions to you. What are some homeland security issues that would benefit from the application of muted voices? What are some obstacles that you foresee in the application of this method? And how can you overcome these challenges? Thank you very much.